Thanks. I think this is the first time in my life I ever had a lectern that was the right height. Usually they're about here, and you know, after you get 40, if you have your print there's no way you can read it. This is great. So it's great to be here, and it's really great for the Montana Human Rights Network to bring me in for this little tour that's going to several cities and ends up in Bozeman for Pride this weekend. And I wanted to just say a couple of things about Bozeman. I did a radio interview this afternoon, and the lead question was from a sympathetic person, was actually a provocative question to get me going, and it was lots of people are saying that to have such a thing as a Pride gathering or parade was destructive to values and was unpatriotic and anti-American. And what did I think about that? And so this is going to start this speech with vision, and then we're going to go somewhere else and come back to vision again. And I said, well, I think that to have a Pride gathering fits right with the dream that we have had in this country for democracy. That many of us, for a long time, have dreamed that there could be a place that was not exploitive, that was not exclusive, that included everyone, that everyone had a place, that everyone could be whole, everyone could be complete. And so to have something called Pride would be a wonderful thing, so that people could help those who suffer from undue ignorance, who suffer from undue prejudice, to open a little bit to understand how many kinds of people occupy this land at this point. And that it's a time that all of us should be celebrating. Every time a group stands up and says, we want you to recognize that we are here too. That we are part of this, we all belong here. Like that wonderful t-shirt that says, we all belong here together. That's why we would have a Pride celebration in Bozeman. The title of my speech tonight is Seeking Liberation in the Time of the Right, or A Grim Tale of Recent Times and Where We Might Gather Hope, I think, at the end of this. So I'm going to talk about bad news first and go to good news. As Ralph mentioned, I've shifted my work over the last few years. I spent most of my adult life being a community organizer, and then sort of ended up being a writer and theorist. And for the last 4 years, since the Oregon and Colorado ballot initiatives, I've spent almost all my time looking at the right, thinking about the right, writing about the right, investigating them, sickening myself with the right. And I am sick of it. But what I feel more strongly than ever now is that we have to defend ourselves from the right because the encroachments are so fierce. But we really have to create a progressive agenda and progressive vision that offers people something that they can attach themselves to, something that provides possible answers to the problems that we're dealing with at the end of the century. And if we don't get the progressive movement or the left in a place where it can present this vision, I think the right will totally eclipse what we have known to be democracy. So that's why I'm going to go with the bad news first and then go to that vision. So these days I focus a bit more on how to develop that vision. Can everyone hear me? I have great acoustics here.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Well, speaking up, for me, I don't have great timbre to my voice, so I can raise my voice a little bit, but I don't know that it will help you. So there are 4 more seats up front, and also you can just gather on up as close as you want to, and just circle right up here. We own the room for the night, and you can take personal power to move in any way that you like to make hearing better, but this is about the best I can do. Is this, for those of you in the back, is that all right? Okay. But I'm a Southerner, and I tend to drop off at the end of a lot of sentences. It's not the best habit, probably. But what I want to talk about is basically stuff that I've been struggling with and trying to figure out this particular time that we're living in. And so I'm looking at the growth of the right, that's been what seems to be rapid in the last few years, but it's actually been developing, since, well, at least certainly since the campaign of Barry Goldwater, and stronger in the 70s and then in the 80s and on up until today. But rather than focusing on the 70s and on the 80s, I want to focus on the 90s and look at the kind of successful organizing that's going on now, and to try to sort of break that down just a little bit for us to think about. And I want to talk about 4 areas where they've been so terrifically successful. And I think that in looking at those, we can sort of see where we need to think more about vision and what our point of view is. And these 4 areas are where they have had such success in organizing white people around racism, organizing heterosexuals around homophobia, organizing men around gender, and organizing middle-class people around economics. And they have been successful in every one of those areas. And what they've managed to do by taking that approach is they've managed to put people together in a larger pool than they ever would have if they had taken just one of those positions. If they'd opened on just one position and said, okay, we're going to stick with this, then lots of people were falling off the side. But what they did is they took something that cut across a lot of different areas. So let's just take those one by one. I'll start, since we're in the month of June, as the columnist said in a nasty little article about the Asian Pacific Islander group in Oregon a couple of weeks ago, that they had an oral history exhibit that is to be presented in Gay and Lesbian Pride Month, formerly known as June. So I thought that was a nasty little bit. So formerly known as June, here we are in the month of Pride. So I'm going to start with organizing heterosexuals around homophobia and the success that's been done with that. And to look at that, we're going to have to go to racism pretty rapidly, and we're going to have to go to sexism pretty rapidly, and we're going to have to go to all of these pretty rapidly. So let's just start with the ballot initiatives of '92. That I think for many people, there wasn't a full consciousness of how heterosexuals were being organized, not so much just around homophobia, but were being organized around whiteness as well. And I think that slipped by a lot of people because the attack seemed so vicious and so directed at lesbians, gay men, bisexual, and transgendered people. So that when we had ballot initiatives that were talking about no special rights for homosexuals. Now, the language of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered is not the language of the right. That is the language of progressive people. Their language is homosexuals. When they started saying no special rights for homosexuals, they redefined civil rights in this country within about a year's time to get virtually everyone to think that civil rights equaled special rights. And where they got that language is actually they dipped over into the reaction against the civil rights movement, that kind of anti-civil rights movement reaction that was occurring, had been occurring all through the 70s and through the 80s. And that was that language. This was not new language for lesbians and gay men. This was old language, and it was the language of racism. So that prior to those ballot initiatives, you had David Duke saying that his campaign slogan was equal rights for all, special rights for none. David Duke from Louisiana, Klansman, still selling Klans literature out of his office while he was running for office, denying that he was a Klansman. Equal rights for all, which is blasphemy from his lips. Special rights for none. So that when they ran the anti-gay and lesbian initiative, they were able to reach over into the history of racism and pick that up. And then they set up those initiatives in such a way that they first talked about that homosexuals should not have minority status. Now this is a word we didn't even know what meant, this minority connected with the word status. But the important piece of that was the word minority. Then they said we're not to have affirmative action or quotas. Now, I and people like Diane Sands over here have been doing work a long time, locally and nationally. And Diane, had you ever heard anybody in the lesbian and gay movement ever say we wanted minority status or affirmative action? Me either. Not anywhere, any place, any time in the last 20 years, last 25 years have I ever heard that. Suddenly here it is saying we must deny it to these people. So why would they say affirmative action? Why would they say minority status? Because both of those words are connected to race. Both of those words. Minority raises the idea of race, doesn't raise the idea of women for most people, it raises the idea of race. And affirmative action, again, raises the idea of race. Then they said that for people to get these special rights, by now, got people thinking not civil rights, but special rights, that you would have to deserve them. It would be, and you introduced the word deserve based on good behavior. And they linked then lesbians and gay men to pedophilia and the ballot initiatives. Taking this sexual abuse of children and linking it over to lesbians and gay men as the perpetrators, as sexual predators. So you've got race, and then you've got the idea of deserve, and then you have the idea of good behavior, and then the final part is that it should be put to the vote. For many of us, we got the fact that it was an effort to dismantle the civil rights movement, the gains of the civil rights movement. What we did not understand at the time, that was preparing the ground for the anti-affirmative action attack. That was preparing the ground for anti-immigration. Because what happened at the same time, at the same time you see that happening, here comes the bell curve. Does everybody remember the bell curve? That little treatise on eugenics? Where what you have presented in that is the notion that people of color, by their very makeup, have a proclivity for crime and criminality, i.e., bad behavior. At the same time, you have the tremendous growth of talk radio and hate radio, and the constant message coming from it that all of the social issues of our time are related to race. And let me just name you some of those social issues. Welfare, racialized, is it not? You're not led to think, in the discussion and the images of welfare, to think about white people. You're led to think about people of color. Immigration, I do not believe that's about Europeans. It is about people of color, clearly. Drugs, affirmative action, we're talking about the hot button issues of our times. Schools, how's that racialized? There's interactive speech. Pretend like you're on the internet. How's it racialized? Busing. That what has destroyed the schools, the problem with schools is the inner city schools. It's the problem is integration of schools, where you have children of merit, i.e. white, sitting with children lacking merit. Public services, which leads you then to anti-taxation, teenage pregnancy, and then the big one of this period, this decade that we're in, is crime. Would you say it's racialized? So here you have two strong issues running side by side in the 90s. And what you have with the anti-gay and lesbian track is a fast track to move not only the organizing of white people and the oppression of lesbians and gay men, but the redefinition of civil rights, the attack against democracy, and the absolute attack against people of color. Is everybody with me? Now you need to stop me in this. We can't have discussion during it, but you could just say, either slow down, because I want to take my watch off here and try to do it. It's always a bad sign when you see a preacher take a watch off, but I want to take it off. So the racialization of those issues through both ballot initiatives and through the media, this is constant press, is that racialization, has led to a very, very strong anti-people of color sentiment in this country. And it's very closely linked both to social problems as well as to economic problems. So then you have the same thing with women. And you began to see the organizing of men around sexism, both through the backlash against the women's movement, through lesbian baiting, the baiting of feminists. You remember the whole thing around feminazis, the attack against clinics. I think the attack against welfare is very much about women. The attack about teenage pregnancy is very much about women. But I wanted to focus just for a minute on Promise Keepers, since I can't talk about it. Was that a leap? Is everybody ready to make that jump? There, I think you see the prime example of organizing men around sexism. And I'm not going to go into that in great length, but I want to go into it for a little bit. For those of you who don't know, are there people here who don't know about Promise Keepers? Do you know that this is a major movement, Christian men's movement, and it meets, it's organized by former Coach McCartney out of Colorado, and the Christian Coalition, Focus on the Family, there's one other group, I guess can't bring up the other name for it. Christian Coalition, Focus on the Family, McCartney, it'll come back to me, of organizing meetings in stadiums around the country for men to gather and to make promises to Christ, to be a greater presence in their communities and to be a greater presence in their homes. Well, I don't know about you, but as a feminist, I have wanted that forever. I want that. I want men to be a greater presence, have more responsibility, to be, more there in community and in home, but not from a sexist point of view, and from a point of view of equality, point of view of sharing. And in watching Promise Keepers, and they're very much watched by people who monitor the right at this moment, it's been very, very hard to talk against them. Because the men who go there don't go there necessarily out of the hatred of women. They don't go there out of the hatred of the women's movement. They go there out of tremendous need, out of feeling that something's really, really wrong with this society and looking for answers. And they go there because they feel a lack in their lives, I believe, for those places to bond with men, where it's not just for sports, but they do go to a place where they feel comfortable because of sports. It's very, very smart to sort of this stadium. Go ahead. This is what I tell you, it's interactive. You can yell out and do whatever you want to. But what are they taught when they get there? I went to the Promise Keepers meeting in Eugene, Oregon last August. 35,000 men and 10 progressive people that I know of. The 10 that we organized to take in, 5 men, 5 women, half people of color, about half lesbian and gay. Turned out to be that way. And it was a remarkable sight. I was very, very happy to have witnessed it. And it's very, very, very moving. They have employed some of the best understanding of psychology that we have available. Some of the best understanding of programming that we have available. It's like think of the best rock concert that you have seen programmed, with beautiful staging, huge screens, great music. Almost everybody on stage is a person of color. Almost everybody in the audience is white. It is fascinating. But what they do is they constantly deliver the message that you are there to learn how to be obedient and to demand obedience from others. Constantly, through music, through word, through message after message after message, that it's the receiving of authority and the delivering of authority. As Christ is to the church, so is man to the family. In 1,000 different ways is that message. Now, the way people look at this goes from everything from the idea that this is just the largest tent revival that has ever been known, that they hope this fall to have their March on Washington, which will be, they assume, about 2 million men, October 4th. You might want to be there, I don't know. So it goes from people who believe that to people who feel that this is the ground troops for fascism. People who feel so alarmed when they see those men stand up and raise those arms, you know, who hear about that authority, the receiving, the delivering, the receiving and delivering from people who say they have no agenda, no political agenda except that of goodness. So anyway, I will leave you with that as an example of organizing men around sexism. And there's strong, strong anti-gay and lesbian stuff in that as well. And then the final piece is organizing middle class and working people, more working class people, middle class people and above, around class, around economics. And this is done through the anti-taxation movement. I believe that the anti-taxation movement is a direct attack against the poor. It's a direct attack against government. Rather than having a war on poverty at this moment, we have a war on poor people. We do a lot of work around welfare repeal in Arkansas, and we do not dignify this with a lie and call it welfare reform. We believe this is about the destruction, the elimination of welfare, and that we would be unwise to go along with the idea that it's simply about reform. But this anti-taxation movement moves off a message, I think, and this is simplifying a good bit, but it moves off a message that I think talk radio helped us a tremendous amount with, as well as lots of other places. But the idea that there's not enough to go around. There's just not enough to go around, which is sort of what we would call the myth of scarcity, combined with the idea of mean-spiritedness. There's not, on the one hand, there's not enough to go around. On the other hand, you are going to take something from me. And the you in that instance most frequently refers to people of color. And it refers to women. And it refers to children. And it refers to lesbians and gay men. And it refers overall to poor people. That you are going to come get something that is mine and there's not enough here to share. And so I have to hold in closer and closer, and there has to be more of us and them, and we have to protect the us and what we own and what we hold dear and what we see as values and what we have as property and what we have as our fundamental rights. And it is a vicious, vicious message. And with it goes that word deserve that I talked about earlier. You know, this notion that some people don't deserve civil rights / special rights. This also goes with the idea that people don't deserve services. You know, they're just out there, no goodniks, you know, they just don't want to work, they're not like us, they're irresponsible, they're just having babies, they. And that myth of scarcity moves beyond money. It also moves to civil and human rights. That if someone gets civil rights protections, then I somehow lose something. So that message has also been moved. So what we've had on the one hand with the anti-taxation movement is that we cut the money that underpins the government on the state, local, national level, and insist on the cut of services. Everything that meets human needs, to slice that away so that but it's built on that emotion of scarcity and mean-spiritedness, or else it wouldn't move. You know, if it didn't have that emotion driving it, I don't believe that could be achieved at this point. And so the government in this, I was saying at dinner before this meeting, that we're in a peculiar position now for many of us in the 60s and 70s. We're fighting the government. You know, we're fighting about the role of the state, you know, and civil rights in the Vietnam War. I mean, the government was our enemy. Now, we're like, oh my goodness, how even to have and maintain a government is what we're looking at. And what is the role of the state in relation to us and us in relation to it, And there's this attack that erodes it all the time, which is not just about money, it's also an attack against the individuals within it, and then the placement of individuals within it that will carry out these agendas. So what we leave on the national level, at least, and perhaps we'll leave that on the state level as well, a government that does not meet human needs, that does not have the money or the resources or the desire to meet human needs, but instead becomes more and more an arm to control people. And I think that is a very, very scary thought. And I said this was going to be a grim picture. And why is that? This becomes a government that deregulates everything, that turns over human services to privatization and to corporations. It's because corporations now stand in control, now are the governance. Globalization of corporate capitalism has moved us to a different plane and to a different world. And that corporate capitalism affects not just people here, it has globalized our lives, both for good or for bad, and very much for bad, in the exploitation of people. Why do we have an anti-immigrant issue? It's because of corporate capitalism. It's because capital can go anywhere it wants, unrestrained, unrestricted, unregulated, and people cannot. It may cross any border that it wishes, and people cannot. And then it becomes the anti-tax movement within this country. So you have unfettered corporations. One of the things that Ronald Reagan did with Reaganomics so well was deregulation, so that we don't have the environmental restrictions that we once had. We don't have, the controls on government. And also there's been a shift in the tax burden, so that the anti-tax movement and sentiment rises out of a feeling that has come because more and more of the tax burden has been shifted off corporations and onto individuals. We have the most outstanding example of this in Oregon that you could ask for, and there's been lots of stuff now printed about that. If anyone wants to look at that at any point, you can get it through the Oregon Public Employees Union that talks about how that shift has occurred so that corporations pay very, very few taxes and get great tax benefits just for putting their plant in your town without regulations, so that it becomes an environmental hazard to have it there. It becomes a potential for exploiting workers to have it there. They have that benefit, and yet individuals are paying taxes and not seeing services, and that is a perfect setup for fierce anger. When you say you're going to have to pay more for your property taxes, but you're not going to have your public library. And people say, well, to hell with paying taxes. Or you're going to pay more for your property taxes, and you're not going to get your public library, and you're going to insist on paying for some immigrant kid to get health care. They say, to hell with taxes. So the right in this country, the theocratic right, the new right, in their organizing, which I think is very different from the far right, in their organizing, worked well to support the control and the dominance of corporations. What they've managed to do is to divert our attention from what is happening with the corporate takeover of not just this nation, but the global takeover, so that rather than looking at what's happening in terms of downsizing, looking at what's happening in terms of deregulation, instead of looking at what's happening in terms of the privatization, instead of looking at what's happening in terms of taking jobs into other countries and exploiting people there, and it goes on and on and on. Instead, the right has been able to say the problem is the people who have fought for civil rights and caused such disruption to this society. The problem is women. The problem is people of color. The problem is poor people. The problem is lesbians and gay men. And now the problem is people with disabilities because that ADA is costing us too damn much. And people have focused on that rather than focusing on the extraordinary disparity between the rich and the poor, the growing disparity between the rich and the poor. You ask about how much CEOs in this country make. The latest thing that Share the Wealth put out, which is this great popular education group out of Boston, is that they make 212 times the average U.S. worker, compared to about in the early 60s when that was about 16 or 17 times, and compared to Germany where I believe it's 21 times their average worker, and compared to Japan where it's about 15 times the average worker. So we have this incredible disparity that's going on in a time in which people are feeling totally uncertain about their job stability, about their income, about their way of life, about whether or not they can have insurance, whether or not they can feed their children, whether or not they can get schooling for them. That kind of uncertainty is going on. And yet the message of the time, if you watch the news very much or listen to the news very much, is that we're in a rolling, healthy economy, a great economy that's producing jobs and producing money. Well, it's producing jobs at the very highest levels. I don't know if you all read that article last week about the top 100 companies in the country, what plans they had for hiring people coming off welfare. Did anybody see that? It's a terrific thing. It's put out by the Associated Press, and the headline was, top 100 firms have no plans to hire people coming off welfare. Well, I called the Women's Project the second I saw it and said, duh. We were hysterical. We were like, who thought they would? 17 firms have at least some plans in place to try to hire people coming off welfare. Among those who have no plans, Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Safeway, Kroger. Kroger's a grocery store in the South. I don't think you have it out here. Those kinds of places, as well as high-tech places and that kind of thing. And it had a quotation from the head of the Chamber of Commerce, the national head, saying, well, if you had someone coming off welfare who was, I can't remember what kind, I wish I had the little quotation in my pocket because I thought it was just worth, a what kind?
Chemical engineer.
Chemical engineer, maybe a pharmaceutical company would hire them. Think about it. Think about it. It was incredible. Do you remember other things from that report?
It was bad.
It was bad, bad. But how about the head of the Chamber of Commerce saying that? All of us should get that and put it on a T-shirt and wear it and go see Bill. Say, Bill, now what about welfare in our time and poverty in our time and all that kind of stuff?
One of the most outrageous things is that somebody like that can say that, and it's not outrageous.
Exactly. And do it with impunity. Do it with impunity.
It's not.
Right. Right. So if you have that, then you have this tremendous growing disparity between the rich and the poor. You have people coming off welfare and not having jobs. And those who do get jobs, I think the sense is now that it will lower the wages of the lowest working tier about 12 or 13%. So there's that in terms of potential conflict and pain. So you have that going on, and you have a government that is under the onslaught of anti-taxation and anti-government sentiment in this country, but particularly anti-taxation, and is systematically refusing to deal with human needs. And instead is becoming more and more a military arm. That its role becomes more and more that of surveillance, that of the invasion of privacy, that of maintaining police, that of maintaining the military, the CIA, the FBI, the development of prisons and turning them over to private corporations, turning social services over to private corporations, turning all of those, turning the national parks, moving more to trying to turn those over to private corporations. It means that if we allow that to happen, the government becomes more and more simply a place that controls people, that does social control. Because if you have the displacement of thousands of workers in this country who are going to have to live off an underground economy or die, and they're being put in jail for participating in an underground economy and all the other ways that they try to survive, then you warehouse more and more and more in prisons. So what we've seen for the last few years is the building of prisons as a growth industry, building of prisons as economic development for communities, and the growth of prisons increasing while crime is going down. Over the last 3 years, crime has gone down, prisons have gone up. So at this point, that we incarcerate more people than the Soviet Union did when it was still intact and when South Africa was living under apartheid. That is the grim picture. That is the control, the government's job becoming the control of the masses to prevent unrest so that corporate success can continue. We are in a good economy, but where is it going? The top 10% of people in this country own 70% of the wealth. That again comes from Share the Wealth out of Boston. So that is the grimness. Now the question is vision. And this is where we get to the hard part, and I hope that you're going to join me in it, because I will have to tell you, I don't have another half hour of vision. I think this is exactly the problem that we face. But I'm going to tell you what I do think in relation to this. And there's a lot more to be said about this. But I think one of the things that has to happen is that rather than fighting in whatever group we're in terms of identity groups, that's just one piece, to become part of the mainstream that represents this kind of injustice is wrong. I think we have to fight to change what is considered the norm in this country, what is considered accepted political and social and economic life in this country, and say we will not stand with it. That instead, that we will throw our lot with the poor. I think we have to talk about economics as we have not talked about economics in a long time in this country. We have to do analysis, and we have to organize. I think people have been afraid since the time of McCarthy in the 50s to talk about economics and this economic system in a very serious way. And we have had some things that were very chilling to make us not want to do that. And one of those things was the Reverend Martin Luther King standing with the sanitation workers in Memphis and being shot down. Of seeing people who held an economic analysis or were moving more strongly toward a tougher economic analysis being eliminated. That has been chilling. All of the McCarthyism was chilling. All of the communism, Cold War, Red Scare was chilling for people to have this kind of discussion. And then it is particularly difficult to do it in a country that runs off rampant consumerism, that we have almost all, been led to participate in one way or the other. So it is hard to stand in the belly of that beast and talk about economics in a way that really addresses economic justice and change. So I think we have to say we are for taxation. We believe in it. We are for taxation. We are pro-taxation. We believe in progressive taxation. We believe that people should pay their fair share, that corporations should absolutely pay their fair share. We could change everything around with a fair and just tax system. And we have to say that human needs are of the greatest importance to us. This is about values.
Absolutely.
This is about values. I think we have to take on the family values stuff. You know, the idea that there would be letters to the editor in this state suggesting that lesbians and gay men are at the heart of society's breakdown, or the family's breakdown, makes me wild, makes me crazed. You know what I think is one of the major things is at the heart of the family's breakdown? And I take a very, very broad view of family. People who live together or not, but are closely connected with a sense of responsibility for one another, a sense of connection to one another, common goals, shared affection and feeling, you know, those kinds of things, accountability. I believe there are families in which there is one adult. I believe there are families in which there are many adults. I believe there are families in which people share the same gender. I think there are families where people are of opposite gender. I think there's every kind of combination. But if we believe that family is important, and I think it's critical because it's the first unit of community. It's not because it's important just because of itself. It is not a sacred shrine. It is because we live collectively or we die. And that is the first piece of making that connection, building relationship, is through family. So what I think goes to the heart of it is that we don't have the resources and through the systems of this government and our community and our communities to support and nurture families. I think it is very, very difficult to maintain a family if you do not have time to give to that family. If everybody over 15 in it is having to work one or more jobs, it is very hard to have family. It's very hard to have family when the community is not set up in a way that supports family, when it doesn't have health care, when it doesn't have child care, when it doesn't have those things that make it possible for us to flourish in those families. It's not about who gets married and who doesn't. It's about how do we support each other to make relationship and live in a society where we are inclusive. That's called community, rather than exclusive, which is called private and tight and withholding. That would solve our immigration attitudes too. What if instead of saying those immigrants are going to take something from us, what if we said instead, how can we be good neighbors? What if we said, half the white people in this country seem to be chasing down their genealogy and trying to figure out what ship they came over on. That we respect other people who come over on ships, whether forced or otherwise, and say, how can we be good neighbors rather than what are they going to take away from us? So I think we have to, I have about 5 or 6 other things to say here, but I'm just going to say 2 more. I think that we have to work for an economic and social democracy. And that's why I think that Pride gathering is important. I think it speaks to democracy. It speaks to participatory democracy. It speaks to inclusive democracy. I think that we have to work in coalition with one another to make that democracy, to learn relationships, how to build them, how to maintain them, how to come to understand one another, not to live with such extraordinary ignorance and prejudice and divisions. But the biggest thing for me is I think that we have to make a choice in our lives. And for me, the choice that we have to make is both religious and moral. And I know in progressive circles, those are not terms that people use a lot, religious and moral, but I'm going to use them. I think that we either believe and choose this road, that to believe that people are of equal worth and are of equal value, and therefore should have full access to everything that can be provided to them, that enables them to live whole and complete lives. Or else we choose to believe that people are not of equal worth and equal value. And I don't know that there's any in-between on that. You don't get to think maybe a little bit of this or a little bit of that. Either people are of equal worth and value or they are not. And if you believe that people are not of equal value and not of equal worth, then what flows out of that is oppression. Everything we know, all of those isms that were talked about earlier, flow from that. Every piece of it. What flows out of the idea of the myth of scarcity and mean-spiritedness combined is scapegoating. And tell me a time in human history when scapegoating has not led to violence. So out of that sense that some people are not as worthy or as truly human as other people leads to that violence, leads to oppression. Out of the other leads to community, inclusion. It leads to democracy. I believe those are moral and religious choices that we have control over, that we can choose which of those roads we're going to walk, which one we're going to put our lives into, which ones we're going to take the risk along the way. And you know, it's a pretty simple idea. It's not complex. Do you believe this or do you believe that? Are you willing to stand behind this or do you want to stand behind that? Where do you want to stand? And probably more importantly, with whom do you want to stand? And for whom are you willing to give up part of what you have been able to gain by chance, by privilege, by gift? Thank you very much.